In 1986, Lake Nyos released a gas so deadly that nearly 2,000 people died without a sound, no struggle, no warning, no chance to run. Nothing burned, nothing broke. The air itself simply vanished. What happened that night remains one of the most disturbing natural disasters in recorded history, and the most silent. If you're enjoying this video, like it, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the Shadow Book for more true stories buried in the dark corners of history. On the morning of August 21, 1986, Lake Nyos presented the same undisturbed landscape it had shown for decades. The crater walls formed a clean rim around the water, their slopes covered with scattered huts made of mud brick and corrugated metal. Families followed predictable routines. Children carried plastic jugs toward communal paths. Herdsmen untied cattle from wooden stakes, and women swept compacted earth yards, where dust lifted briefly under each stroke. Nothing in the scene indicated that the water beneath them held a rising concentration of CO, layered under pressure in the lake's deepest basin. By mid-morning, fishermen returned from the center of the lake, their dugout canoes carving slow lines across the surface. Their nets contained fewer tilapia than usual, but no one attributed the decline to geological causes. A rope tied loosely around a cow's neck dragged through the mud near the shoreline as livestock approached for water, unaware that the lake sat above a volcanic field capable of releasing gas without heat or flame. The fishermen secured their paddles against hut walls and joined the midday routines without comment. Throughout the afternoon, the valley retained its usual quiet rhythm. Women washed clothes at shallow inlets. Young boys chased each other along narrow footpaths where the dust rose briefly beneath their sandals. The crater lake appeared unchanged, a large, still body of water resting in a volcanic bowl, but beneath its surface, CO continued to accumulate in the lower layers. The lake's stratification remained unnoticed, and no monitoring instruments had ever been installed to measure the rising concentration. To villagers, the water was simply part of the landscape, predictable and harmless. A week earlier, a visiting geologist had made an informal remark to elders, stating that the lake had a metallic odor that suggested unusual activity at depth. The observation was delivered conversationally and met with polite interest but no alarm. To residents accustomed to generational stability, the lake did not behave unpredictably, and environmental shifts were interpreted as common variations. The comment filtered out of community memory as quickly as it had entered it. By late afternoon, cattle grazed near the crater walls, lifting their heads only when the wind carried faint drafts of cooler air. A kerosene lantern stood on a mud brick shelf inside one of the huts, still unlit but prepared for evening use. The shoreline remained quiet, with no irregular bird behavior or visible disturbances. The water was steady enough that it reflected the sky without distortion. Children returned to their homes carrying jugs filled earlier from springs slightly above lake level, and households prepared for routine evening meals. As the sun began to descend, the transition from daylight to dusk unfolded with its usual efficiency. Shadows formed clean lines along hut perimeters, and herdsmen guided cattle toward enclosed nighttime pens. The lake's surface darkened quickly, becoming a flat, uninterrupted sheet of black. Insects that typically hovered near the shoreline were noticeably absent, though the absence was subtle enough that no one remarked on it. The final moments of daylight revealed a surface without ripples, movement, or sound. When night finally settled over the crater, the lake remained motionless, holding its accumulated gas beneath layers of cold, still water. Nothing in the surrounding villages indicated anything had changed. Yet below the silent surface, pressure continued to build, preparing to alter the valley before dawn quietly, without warning. In the early evening, the valley remained quiet except for routine movement inside the clustered huts. A herdsman tied a fresh length of rope to a wooden post while his children arranged cooking pots near the doorway. Inside one of the structures, a metal bowl rattled once on a wooden shelf, producing a brief metallic vibration. The sound was too minor to indicate geological activity and too brief to draw more than a passing glance. This region of Cameroon experienced negligible seismic movement, and residents had no frame of reference for interpreting faint ground shifts as warnings. Outside, the air cooled rapidly after sunset, a common pattern in the highlands. Moisture gathered near the surface of the crater, creating pockets of chilled air that drifted downhill. A chicken fluttered from its perch and settled again, unsettled by the sudden change in temperature. A few villagers paused, sensing the shift, but dismissed it as nightfall's routine arrival rather than a destabilizing factor affecting the lake's stratified layers. No early warning systems existed to identify the cold front interacting with the water column. Moments later, a faint rumble moved through the valley. It resembled the low roll of distant thunder, though no storm clouds appeared in the sky. A man repairing a fishing net lifted his head but returned to his work when the noise failed to repeat. The tremor, likely triggered by a minor rockfall along the crater wall, passed beneath the huts with minimal strength. It was insufficient to register on regional monitoring equipment, and even if recorded, would not have been considered abnormal. The lake's surface reacted with a single shallow ripple that traveled outward before disappearing entirely. Animals, however, reacted differently. Cattle tethered near the slope shifted their weight and emitted low, uneasy sounds. Dogs trotted toward interior corners of huts or tucked themselves near their owners' feet. Birds that typically lingered near the shoreline moved abruptly toward higher trees, avoiding the water without visible provocation. Their behavior suggested sensitivity to vibrations or subtle changes in gas levels, phenomena noticed only by species that respond instinctively to environmental irregularities. Humans, engaged in evening tasks, did not interpret these disruptions as signs of danger. As dusk deepened, families completed their routines with no further interruptions. A woman lowered a pot of water onto 3 stones arranged for cooking. A child wiped dust from a wooden stool near the doorway. Their gestures were unhurried, reflecting a community experienced in predictable nights and familiar weather conditions. Even if anyone had sensed a brief instability, they lacked the conceptual framework to connect a faint tremor with latent volcanic gas beneath the lake. The crater's history had never included a catastrophic release visible to their generation. A light wind passed across the valley floor, carrying cooler air toward the lake. Shadows lengthened around the crater wall, leaving the water in near-total darkness. No one lingered long enough at the shoreline to observe that the lake's surface, typically broken by insects or occasional fish movement, remained unnaturally smooth. With darkness settling, villagers retreated indoors, unaware that the lake's internal structure had shifted in response to the earlier disturbance. In the center of the lake, a small plume of bubbles rose through the water. The disturbance expanded slightly before merging with the surrounding darkness. No resident saw the formation, and no animal remained close enough to react. The lake returned to silence, but its internal layers no longer held their previous stability. Shortly after midnight, Lake Nyos shifted from stillness to mechanical disturbance without sound or preliminary warning. At the lake's center, water rose in a vertical column as pressurized layers from the depths lost structural stability. The displacement resembled the upward surge of a geyser, but there was no heat, steam, or visible light. It was the physical consequence of a sudden pressure drop in the lake's deepest strata, where CO had accumulated over years. Within moments, the rising column lost coherence and collapsed outward, forcing waves toward the crater walls. As the water settled, a new disturbance became visible. White froth spread quickly across the surface. The froth marked the point where gas-laden water reached the upper, lower pressure layers and released CO in large volumes. The contrast between the agitated center and the otherwise dark surroundings emphasized how localized the mechanical eruption initially appeared. No one stood close enough to interpret these changes as hazards. The valley's residents were indoors, asleep, or positioned far from the shoreline. An overturned canoe at the edge of the lake remained untouched by the waves, indicating that the disturbance focused upward rather than outward. Within seconds, the lake discharged CO into the air. The gas emerged without fire or smoke, forming a dense, invisible column that rose briefly before losing buoyancy. CO is heavier than air. The released gas formed a mass that expanded across the water's surface and then folded downward. Where warm surface water attempted to rise, the newly freed gas displaced it immediately. The lake's exhalation produced no audible signal. The valley registered no thunder-like noise, no rushing air, and no vibration distinctive enough to rouse residents. The first visible indication of the event occurred along the shoreline. Lanterns positioned near hut entrances extinguished abruptly as the CO displaced oxygen in their vicinity. The flames disappeared almost simultaneously, creating a narrow dark band that spread outward as the gas reached new pockets of air. Had anyone been awake, the extinguishing lights might have provided the first clue of the unfolding disaster. Instead, the shoreline transitions occurred without observation, resembling a series of disconnected outages rather than a single catastrophic pattern. The gas cloud thickened as more CO erupted from the lake. The internal pressure within Nyos continued to decrease, allowing deeper layers of saturated water to ascend and release additional gas. The cloud moved with mechanical consistency, neither accelerating nor hesitating. When it reached the outer edges of the crater, it descended along natural contours, driven by density rather than wind. The ground-hugging movement resembled fog spreading downslope, though it lacked visible form and produced none of the sensory cues associated with weather. As the cloud left the immediate shoreline, waves settled back into place, and the lake's surface regained its dark stillness. The eruption itself was not explosive. It was an overturning effect, a physical redistribution of layers prompted by the earlier destabilization. No structural markers indicated that nearly a cubic kilometer of CO had been released. The water's behavior after the eruption suggested a return to equilibrium, but the air composition had already shifted beyond survivable levels for anything in the cloud's descending path. The gas continued to move toward the sleeping villages, following the valley's curves with predictable precision. No person or animal reacted at this stage. Every living being within range remained unaware of the silent threat approaching them. The cloud maintained its downward course, steady and unstoppable, as it left the lake behind. As the CO cloud began its descent from the crater rim, it maintained a uniform, ground-hugging movement characteristic of dense gas released in large volumes. The cloud's leading edge entered the upper paths of the nearest village without generating heat, sound, or visible form. Inside the huts, residents remained asleep in positions typical for rural households in the region, some on raised wooden frames, others on woven mats placed directly on compacted earth floors. The limited ventilation in these structures created conditions where oxygen displacement would occur quickly once the gas entered. The first physiological symptoms appeared without dramatic onset. A man sleeping near a doorway shifted briefly and placed a hand on his chest as his breathing became shallow. His lantern, still burning low after the previous evening's tasks, produced a shrinking flame that narrowed to a faint point before extinguishing. A wooden stool near the entrance remained undisturbed, but the air composition within the hut changed rapidly as CO displaced oxygen in a measurable sequence. No residents interpreted the flame's disappearance as a warning. The transition occurred during hours when most households were in deep rest. Livestock housed in adjacent enclosures reacted marginally earlier than the humans. A tethered goat attempted to stand, then lowered itself as if its legs failed to support weight. Cattle resting in a nearby pen adjusted their positions, but did not vocalize, indicating a loss of muscular strength rather than agitation. Their breathing patterns slowed, and some collapsed without moving again. The cloud continued moving along established footpaths, passing under fences, through gaps in hut walls, and across the village's central yard. In one household, a woman briefly awakened, sensing an unusual heaviness in the air. She attempted to sit upright, but experienced sudden dizziness and lowered herself back onto the mat. A lantern positioned on a mud brick shelf near her emitted a final flicker before going dark. The sequence in her hut mirrored what occurred in dozens of other structures across the settlement. A brief period of discomfort followed by rapid unconsciousness. The absence of any smell or burning sensation made the event indistinguishable from ordinary fatigue or sudden illness. As the cloud thickened, it entered doorways at floor level, spreading under beds and across household items without obstruction. A child sleeping on a raised frame coughed once, a soft reflexive sound that did not progress into distress because consciousness faded immediately afterward. A cooking pot left near the doorway reflected a faint glint of moonlight before the gas obscured the view. The cloud did not pause or change speed. It moved according to density gradients, following the village's downward slope. Minutes before the gas reached the lower huts, the village entered complete blackout. Fires in cooking areas died one after another, creating an ordered pattern of extinguished light sources across the valley. For anyone awake, the blackout would have appeared coordinated, though no human action caused it. The absence of flame meant that oxygen levels had already fallen below the threshold required for combustion, indicating that CO concentrations were high enough to threaten life. A woman in one of the outer huts stirred and rose to fetch water, responding to routine discomfort rather than fear. As she approached the doorway, she paused, hearing what resembled a low wind outside. She noted, however, that the leaves on the nearest tree remained still. Without further hesitation, she stepped beyond the threshold, unaware that the sound did not come from wind, but from the faint, shifting movement of the gas cloud nearing ground level. Within minutes of the CO cloud reaching the valley floor, the villages entered a phase of near-simultaneous unconsciousness. The progression followed a clear physiological sequence: impaired breathing, muscular weakness, and immediate loss of consciousness once oxygen concentration fell below survivable levels. In one hut, a man preparing to put away a metal bowl collapsed while still holding it, his hand loosening only after his body settled onto the compacted earth. The bowl came to rest beside him without rolling, indicating the absence of sudden movement or struggle. Outside, a child attempting to reach a doorframe paused mid-step, then slumped forward as the CO displaced the remaining oxygen inside the hut. The wooden door, slightly ajar, remained untouched. The child's position reflected a typical suffocation posture: arms relaxed, no defensive reaction, and no signs of distress on the face. These details would later aid investigators in determining how quickly consciousness was lost once the cloud reached enclosed spaces. There were no overturned objects or signs of panic. The transition from alertness to collapse occurred too rapidly for voluntary response. Livestock across the settlement displayed similar patterns. A cow near the boundary fence lowered its head, exhaled once, and fell onto its side in a straight, unbroken motion. The animal did not thrash or attempt to reposition itself afterward. A goat tethered to a post lay in the exact orientation it occupied seconds earlier, its body angled toward the hut entrance as if still waiting to be fed. The uniformity of these collapse positions indicated oxygen deprivation rather than trauma or poisoning. The herd's arrangement, still orderly, undisturbed, visually documented the cloud's path. Inside other homes, families lying on woven mats lost consciousness nearly simultaneously. A cooking pot resting near a woman's hand remained upright, suggesting the event occurred before she could react to the dizziness that precedes collapse. A man lying on a raised bed frame had shifted slightly, likely in response to a brief attempt to inhale before consciousness faded. In another hut, an infant remained asleep against a sibling's shoulder, the posture unchanged even after both lost the ability to breathe properly. The scene lacked noise, movement, or disarray. The cloud continued to move through alleys and low spaces, collecting first in depressions and then spreading outward. Huts positioned in the lowest parts of the settlement experienced the effects earliest and most intensely, while those on modestly elevated patches of ground encountered the gas moments later. Houses built into the hillside showed delayed onset, but the progression remained consistent. The rate of oxygen displacement depended on elevation, structural ventilation, and distance from the initial release. Far above the valley, a herdsman sleeping on a higher slope stirred and awakened. His hut, built several meters above the village perimeter, remained unaffected during the initial descent. He noticed no odor, no heat, and no unusual taste in the air. What he detected instead was the absence of ambient night sounds. No insects, no lowing cattle, no movement from neighboring huts reached his ears. The silence appeared complete, creating a discrepancy between expectation and immediate environment. He stepped outside, adjusting to the faint moonlight, and looked toward the valley. The village below showed no visible activity, not even the dim glow of cooking fires or lanterns. As he moved closer to the edge of the slope, he saw a pale white-gray layer clinging to the earth. The formation did not rise or disperse like fog. It remained fixed against the ground, covering the village in a still, unmoving sheet. At sunrise, the first surviving villagers stepped outside their huts, expecting the familiar sounds that typically marked the beginning of them. Day cattle shifting in their pens, chickens scratching at the ground, and birds moving across the crater rim. Instead, the valley remained silent in a way that did not resemble early morning quiet, but rather a total absence of life. The air held no movement except for the faint drift of cool currents descending from the northern slope. A leaf on the ground, coated in a thin layer of brown residue, lay motionless despite the slight breeze. One of the survivors approached the path leading toward the lake, adjusting the cloth wrapped around his shoulders. His pace slowed as soon as he saw the shoreline. The water, which had appeared uniformly dark the night before, now displayed a deep red coloration. The hue came from iron-rich layers that had been pulled from the depths during the night as overturning event and oxidized upon contact with the surface. The transformation produced a uniform crimson tone across the entire lake, a phenomenon historically documented in limnic disturbances, but unfamiliar to local residents. The survivor remained at a distance, attempting to interpret the change without stepping closer. Vegetation near the waterline showed visible damage. Small trees and shrubs stood with wilted leaves, some appearing burned despite the absence of fire. A fishing net lay untouched on the shore, its lines stiffened and its surface coated with residue from the gas release. Chickens that had roosted near the lake were positioned on the ground in natural resting postures, their bodies unmoved since the previous evening. The lack of struggle indicated that they had lost consciousness within seconds of exposure. No insects crawled on the exposed earth, and no birds flew above the water, a contrast to typical morning conditions in the region. Further along the path, other survivors began emerging from hillside huts. Their observations were consistent. Livestock remained motionless, water containers lay where they had been left the previous night, and every fire pit was cold. The valley's stillness did not resemble recovery from a storm or community sleep. It aligned more closely with the aftermath of an event that had removed airflow and oxygen from entire sections of the settlement. The survivors exchanged brief comments, noting the absence of odor, smoke, or structural damage. The lack of visible violence made the situation difficult to interpret. As they descended toward the lower huts, the survivors observed the positions of their neighbors. A woman sat beside the entrance to her home, leaning slightly forward as though resting. Her cooking pot remained upright next to her hand. Nearby, a child lay across a woven mat inside a hut, positioned exactly as he would be during sleep. A man who had been preparing to tie his sandals sat against a wall, his posture unchanged from the moment his muscles stopped functioning. The consistency across these scenes suggested loss of consciousness rather than panic. The group moved cautiously toward the village center, stepping around livestock that had collapsed in straight lines or rested with heads lowered. A goat lay near a fence, oriented toward the path as if waiting to be untethered. No signs of struggle or distress marked the ground. The survivors' attention shifted back toward the lake, whose red surface reflected the rising sun without movement or sound. Then one of them stopped suddenly. Looking across the open yard, he recognized the pattern repeated on every side. Bodies positioned naturally, clothing undisturbed, belongings left exactly as they had been handled. No one appeared to have stood, run, or attempted to flee. The realization formed clearly: none of the victims had woken up to see what was happening. The valley had not witnessed panic. It had witnessed complete, silent collapse. The first officials reached the valley shortly after sunrise, responding to reports delivered by survivors who had climbed toward neighboring settlements. Cameroon's emergency protocols in the 1980s relied heavily on local administrators, military officers, and regional nurses, none of whom carried equipment suited for evaluating large-scale environmental events. Their arrival followed standard procedure: confirm casualties, assess visible hazards, and determine whether evacuation or quarantine was necessary. As they descended toward Lake Nyos, they encountered stillness inconsistent with any known category of disaster. At the entrance to the first cluster of huts, a regional nurse paused. A water gourd rested beside an unmoving hand, positioned as though the person had been preparing to lift it. The nurse approached cautiously, checking pulse and respiration with routine motions. Both were absent, yet there were no signs of trauma, illness, or struggle. The body appeared to belong to someone who had simply ceased to breathe. The nurse exchanged brief, subdued comments with the accompanying administrator before moving to the next hut. Inside, the pattern repeated. A nurse's clipboard, set against the doorframe while she knelt beside a woven mat, recorded the positions of 3 individuals found lying as if asleep. One had collapsed against the wall, legs extended. Another remained on a mat with arms resting at the sides. A child lay on a blanket with no indication of discomfort. The nurse looked for discoloration, injury, or muscular rigidity, but found none. The absence of physical trauma eliminated violent intrusion. The absence of lesions or fluid discharge challenged infectious explanations. Her composure faltered when she entered another home and found an entire family positioned in natural sleeping postures, their belongings undisturbed. Officials gathered outside to discuss preliminary theories. A chemical attack was suggested due to the sudden, simultaneous nature of the deaths, but the remote location made such a possibility unlikely. An administrator proposed mass poisoning through a contaminated food source, though livestock and wildlife were also found dead in natural poses. An epidemic remained a consideration until investigators noted that no one had shown outward symptoms prior to collapse. The theories circulated without evidence to support them. As the team proceeded deeper into the valley, they observed a consistent detail across all structures. Every lamp, candle, and cooking stove had gone out during the night. The extinguishing appeared synchronized, matching the pattern of collapse among humans and animals. Fire pits contained unburned wood, long cooled. Lantern wicks were intact but surrounded by darkness. The officials noted that these light sources relied on oxygen, leading them to consider the possibility of sudden atmospheric depletion, a phenomenon outside their training and experience. A medical officer conducted basic checks on several bodies, verifying the absence of burns, toxins identifiable by smell, or signs of respiratory struggle. No fingernail marks, unusual skin coloration, or contortions were present. Victims appeared untouched, resting in positions consistent with natural sleep or momentary pause. The uniformity unsettled the investigators, who were accustomed to associating disaster with visible damage. By late morning, the team documented more than 100 fatalities and numerous dead animals within a small radius. Their notes contained repeated references to the same features: no trauma, no indication of panic, and simultaneous expiration across entire households. The pattern was too consistent to align with any conventional cause. Recognizing the limits of their expertise, officials drafted urgent messages requesting scientific support. They prepared communications for geological and medical authorities, stating that the pattern of death required immediate investigation. The reports emphasized the same conclusion. The event appeared coordinated not by human action, but by an unseen environmental force. The first scientific team reached Lake Nyos within days, equipped with limnology tools, basic gas detectors, and field kits intended for environmental surveys rather than mass fatality investigations. Their objective was to reconstruct the sequence of events using measurable data rather than eyewitness accounts. The initial assessments focused on the lake's surface conditions, which displayed an unusual reddish coloration, consistent with the oxidation of iron-rich water brought to the top during a sudden overturn. A probe descending into the water column provided the first definitive indication that the lake still contained elevated CO levels. Measurements showed saturation far above what normal stratification could sustain. Using sampling bottles lowered by calibrated lines, researchers documented temperature layers, chemical composition, and dissolved gas concentration at various depths. The readings revealed that the deepest layers had been supersaturated with CO for an extended period, held stable only by the weight of the water above them. The overturning event had allowed these layers to rise rapidly, releasing gas at a rate estimated to exceed 1 cubic kilometer within minutes. Researchers noted that the lake's structure resembled a sealed reservoir ruptured from within, with no thermal activity or volcanic explosion accompanying the release. As the team examined the surrounding terrain, they observed a pattern in the distribution of victims. A chalk outline drawn on a field map traced the valley's contours, revealing that the gas had followed natural drainage pathways. Human and animal deaths occurred almost exclusively below a specific elevation threshold. Above that line, vegetation appeared undamaged, fires had not extinguished, and livestock survived. Below it, the symmetry of the casualties documented the cloud's path with precision. Insects, typically resilient to environmental fluctuations, were found uniformly dead in zones aligned with the densest gas flow. A second team conducted ground-level air sampling across different elevations. Their instruments showed that residual CO levels remained higher in depressions and low-lying stretches of the valley. These findings supported the conclusion that the gas cloud had moved as a dense layer rather than dispersing upward. Models of gas behavior in confined valleys estimated that the cloud had traveled approximately 25 kilometers from the lake, maintaining lethal concentrations throughout its course. The uniformity of collapse positions recorded by investigators aligned with this modeling. Once oxygen dropped below critical thresholds, loss of consciousness occurred almost instantly. The scientists reconstructed the event using the combination of water chemistry, topographic mapping, and casualty distribution. Their preliminary conclusions stated that the eruption was not explosive, but mechanical, a sudden overturn of stratified layers triggered by a minor disturbance. This finding challenged early theories that suggested chemical contamination, disease, or deliberate poisoning. The researchers emphasized that the absence of visible trauma in victims, combined with the extinguishing of all flames, indicated atmospheric displacement rather than biological or toxic agents. During a late afternoon briefing, a geochemist summarized the data with minimal interpretation. The lake had produced a silent, invisible gas release, capable of killing everything in its path with no auditory or visual cues. The event matched descriptions of rare limnic eruptions documented in geological literature, though never on this scale. As the discussion shifted toward long-term implications, one conclusion began to anchor itself among the experts. This phenomenon might not be unique to a single night. Historical sediment patterns, combined with accounts of unexplained livestock deaths from decades earlier, suggested the possibility of smaller, undocumented gas releases. These events likely went unnoticed due to their limited reach. The team recognized that the disaster of 1986 marked not the beginning of the lake's instability, but simply the first time the gas had reached populated valleys. The final note in the day's report stated the concern clearly. Lake Nyos still contained enough CO to trigger another eruption unless immediate mitigation measures were developed. In the days following the scientific surveys, investigators assembled in a temporary field station overlooking Lake Nyos. Their objective was to determine what force had initiated the overturning event. A sample bottle stood on a metal table beside stacks of field notes, each page filled with conflicting sketches illustrating potential triggers: a minor landslide, a localized volcanic tremor, or rapid surface cooling caused by evening rainfall. None of these explanations accounted for every observation, yet each carried enough plausibility to remain under consideration. The lack of definitive evidence became the central barrier to establishing a coherent explanation. One group argued that a small landslide along the crater wall could have displaced deep water, allowing CO-rich layers to rise. They pointed to debris patterns found near the lake's western rim. However, the amount of displaced material appeared too minor to destabilize the entire water column. A volcanologist countered that a microseismic event, too weak to register on the region as limited 1980s monitoring equipment, could have been responsible. Without seismic records, this possibility could neither be confirmed nor dismissed. The debate repeated itself with slight variations, reflecting the uncertainty inherent in reconstructing an invisible event. Another theory centered on the abrupt cooling of surface water due to nighttime temperature changes. If the surface layer cooled enough to sink, it could have forced deeper layers upward. Meteorological records from nearby stations showed cooler than average temperatures that night, but no data suggested a drop significant enough to induce a full overturn. The scientists reviewed these findings around a notebook page marked with overlapping diagrams, none of which aligned cleanly with field observations. Each theory possessed partial explanatory power, but lacked the completeness required for scientific consensus. Political pressure complicated the discussion. Government officials sought immediate answers to reassure displaced residents, yet the investigators were unable to offer certainty. The limitations of available technology hindered their ability to test hypotheses with the precision necessary for definitive conclusions. Portable CO sensors, water column samplers, and topographic models were useful, but insufficient for reconstructing the exact sequence of micro-events that led to the eruption. The absence of real-time data from before the disaster created gaps that could not be filled. The team shifted focus to pressure buildup. Measurements from the lake indicated that the CO concentration at depth had been critically high. This suggested that the lake had been vulnerable for years, and that the triggering event may have been incidental rather than causal. In this view, the lake required only a minimal disturbance to release the stored gas. Any small shift in temperature or pressure might have been enough. Though this explanation provided the most comprehensive framework, it still lacked a specific initiating detail. During a late afternoon meeting, one scientist summarized the problem succinctly. Every proposed trigger could have caused the event, but none could be proven. The lack of seismic records eliminated earthquake confirmation. The minor nature of detected debris made landslide conclusions weak. Meteorological data offered insufficient justification for a thermal overturn. The investigators reached a rare point of agreement. Identifying the exact trigger might be impossible. The discussion turned toward future risk. All models indicated that, unless intervention occurred, the lake could accumulate dangerous levels of CO again. The data suggested no natural mechanism capable of preventing another eruption. The investigators noted that the 1986 disaster was likely not the first release, but merely the first one large enough to reach populated areas. Locals who had survived refused to return to their homes, despite efforts to provide reassurance. Their reluctance stemmed not from superstition, but from the palpable uncertainty left behind. Without a clear trigger, no one could guarantee that the lake would remain stable. As the investigators concluded their assessments, one final statement appeared in the report. The lake remains dangerous, and time continues to build pressure beneath its surface. In the months after the disaster, engineering teams installed the first degassing pipes into Lake Nyos. The equipment consisted of long vertical tubes anchored to floating platforms, positioned to draw CO-rich water from the depths and vent it harmlessly into the atmosphere. The process relied on self-sustaining flow. Once the gas-laden water began rising, the pressure difference kept it moving upward. Observers noted the steady column of bubbles emerging at the surface, a controlled release replacing the uncontrolled eruption that had devastated the valley. Photographs and field notes documented each step, capturing the lake undergoing its first deliberate intervention. Relocation efforts progressed alongside the engineering work. Survivors were moved miles away into newly assigned settlements. Many refused to occupy homes located near valleys or depressions. Interviews conducted by social workers recorded recurring themes: disrupted sleep patterns, reluctance to approach bodies of water, and persistent unease triggered by silence in the environment. A survivor described stacking belongings outside a temporary shelter every night, unable to sleep indoors due to memories of the sudden collapse of air in the valley. Their belongings, blankets, cooking pots, and clothing formed a perimeter around their sleeping place, reflecting a practical attempt to create distance from enclosed spaces. Monitoring protocols were established by geological teams who returned at regular intervals to measure gas concentration and stratification within the lake. Instruments lowered through the water column provided updated readings of temperature gradients and dissolved gas levels. Reports indicated that while the degassing pipe reduced pressure in the upper layers, CO continued to seep upward from the volcanic field beneath the lake. This steady influx required constant oversight, as stratification could rebuild if left unmanaged. Engineers marked this in their documentation as an ongoing hazard rather than a resolved issue. Survivors interviewed years later described a psychological shift that persisted long after the physical danger diminished. A child who had lived through the event, now an adolescent, explained that he often woke during the night expecting to hear the lake breathing, again a term he used to describe the silent release of gas that had killed his family. He recalled the absence of noise more vividly than any visible detail. His testimony matched broader findings. The lasting horror of the event resided not in visible destruction, but in the memory of silence. Field researchers returning to the valley noted that vegetation had regrown and wildlife had slowly returned, yet the environment retained an undercurrent of instability. Gas detectors placed near depressions recorded occasional spikes in CO concentration, though none reached dangerous levels. These readings reinforced the understanding that the lake remained active beneath its calm surface. Teams emphasized the necessity of maintaining the degassing system without interruption. During a review meeting at the end of the monitoring cycle, scientists compared recent data with the initial post-disaster measurements. The graph showed a gradual rise in deep water CO concentration, despite the continuous operation of the degassing pipe. The findings suggested that the geological source feeding the lake remained active, and that pressure could rebuild if not countered by additional interventions. The team noted this in precise language, avoiding speculation but acknowledging the implications. As final observations were recorded, an aerial survey captured the lake from above. The surface appeared calm, with only the vertical pipes breaking the uniform sheen. Each pipe released a steady chain of bubbles, creating subtle circles of disturbance in an otherwise motionless expanse. Beneath that calm surface, instruments detected the slow accumulation of gas, silent, steady, and ongoing. The chapter closed with a single conclusion: the silence that marked the night of the disaster had never fully lifted.